Yes.
Okay, let's move on to one I just saw. I'm not going to bring up the chat, just the comment, but it was about Whitmer. And now I actually, because you mentioned this, and I'm not familiar with these developments, but I'm curious, and I may have to do a follow-up. I've heard discussion about the accused in her kidnapping case. Strong discussion that they were in fact basically entrapped, and that it was the FBI sort of, I don't want to say orchestrating this, but setting it up to the point where they were setting it up to find people to do it. And the question becomes whether or not these individuals would have ever otherwise entertained the idea, but for the FBI egging them on. So what are the details? I don't know the details. I know the 30,000 foot overview.
So the basics are, for entrapment law, is that because an undercover government agent incentivized or encouraged you to do something is why you did it. Now, it's a tough defense because you have to prove you never would have done it otherwise. But an honest investigation, the way they avoid an entrapment defense, is they never recommend, instigate, initiate, promote, support, or sponsor any illicit activity. They're just there to take information and process it and maybe play along at a low level, but they don't say, hey, let's go kill so-and-so. They don't say, let's go kidnap so-and-so. They don't say, hey, here's a means we could do so. Hey, what about using this weapon? Because once you do that, you're really getting into entrapment space. What the FBI knows is that you can approach any vulnerable, susceptible group of radicals, left, right, anywhere, and you can plant crazy ideas in their head and get them to, on paper, agree to things that they end up never doing and criminally prosecute them if you want. What's intriguing to me is that somehow magically the FBI has not managed to do this with anybody related to Antifa. I just find that fascinating. If anybody believes they're not really infiltrating Antifa, go back and watch the church committee hearings, and you can just Google church committee Klan member, because one of the lead members infiltrating the Klan for the purposes of instigating and motivating the Klan to do some of the most horrendous acts during the 1960s was an FBI agent. So there's a history of this. Two other good documentaries on this. One is the Newburgh Sting, which is Newburgh, and the other one that I'm familiar with is Better This World. Similar patterns, and it's also portrayed in the Showtime show in one of the seasons, Homeland. And when I think it's season 5, it's before they go off the rail. The last season was good. The next to last season was terrible because they became obsessed with Russiagate and all that nonsense. But the season before that was good, and it details where they basically they create the story. In other words, and so what looks like happened here from the early information that we're getting is that nobody came up with a plan to kidnap Whitmer. Not just one FBI agent, apparently 3 undercover law enforcement agents found a couple of nut jobs who are bragging on the internet, which, by the way, gives you an idea that these are not people who plan anything, right? And the real violent Antifa types, they don't put their face on camera. In fact, they beat up people that try to take photos of them at any level that could be identifying. These guys were out saying crazy stuff on their little YouTube channels for forever. So that means they're a talker, not a doer anyway. So what happens is they infiltrate their group, the law enforcement does, and apparently the idea came from the feds. The feds were like, hey, wouldn't this be great? Wouldn't this send a real message? In fact, I know some people. I know how we can get to her house. I know how we can do this. Apparently, the only overt act ever taken to do this was to get near one of her vacation homes, number one, though apparently it's not clear they even ever scoped it out effectively.
Well, and I'm suspecting the only reason they might have known any addresses would have been through the agents themselves.
Yes. They're the ones who are saying, hey, we can go here, we can get her at this location, let's go look at it. They're helping to organize the effort. They're orchestrating it, and then they recommend, hey, let's go get some weapons, and they make sure people go get weapons, and one person gets, I think, a stun gun. So that's the scope of it. That's the full way apparently it reached. This never reached actual actionable time frame that I can tell, and it appears all of it was cooked up by and it tells you where the FBI is. The FBI is hiding evidence in the Hunter Biden case, which involves one of the biggest scandals involving a major political candidate in American history because of the amount of money involved, the number of actors involved, the range of time period involved. They're burying that scandal while they're creating a fake scandal to indict a bunch of whack jobs or people that are a little off their meds in order to create a fake story of something that was never going to happen. In fact, as soon as I read it the first time, I was suspicious of it. So I was like, this reminds me of that bad Boston movie with Dan Aykroyd where they're going to kidnap a basketball player in order to save the Boston Celtics. And it had like quasi comedic components to the story. And then when they were trying to spin it as a right-wing militia group, I'm familiar with a lot of those groups. I was like, this isn't really a right-wing militia group. These are a bunch of people whacking on, just talking on the internet that are a little bit off. That it sound more left, if anything, and they just really just sound off, like the Boogaloo Boys. Those people are just mostly nuts. They're not on any political side that you can identify consistently. So it appears that this was totally made up, and they've done this. They've done this in terrorism cases. They've done this. I mean, what happened in the Better This World case? They got a couple of kids from Austin. One of them, by the way, is now a big Breitbart writer. Was the rat informant for the government, Brandon Darby. Got a couple of kids, susceptible teenagers who said, hey, let's go bomb the Republican National Convention 2004. We're going to bring about the revolution, man, all that kind of jazz. They never actually took any meaningful action. They went further than these kids did. And it was clearly just one big entrapment because it was all plotted and planned by the government agent. There's several terrorism cases where they've done this. In order to make themselves look good that way, they broke up a big terrorist plot. They infiltrate some small group of susceptible-minded Muslims that attend, say, a radical cleric's place, but they're not obvious. A real terrorist cell, very hard to actually infiltrate. So what it is they get these susceptible kids to talk big, and then they arrest them all, and they say, hey, we just saved this building from being blown up, when there's often no evidence that was ever going to occur. The idea was initiated and instigated and propagated by the government agent themselves. So that's what it looks like really happened in Whitmer. While Whitmer's doing her 8645 message. Like, you want to talk about, here she's complaining about Trump somehow magically sending dog whistles to these kids who are clearly entrapped by the feds, while she's sending I don't even know, do you call that a dog whistle? When it says 8645?
Look, so the funny thing is we talk about bias and we talk about projection, but there's another theory that I view the world, sorry, was it subject product? Okay, I thought I did something bad. I've realized that we can only view the world through the prism of our own knowledge. So I've never heard of 86. I've never heard of 86ing anybody. I worked at I worked at Second Cup. I've worked restaurants. I've never heard
86.
Never in my life. So I
heard it from the time I was a kid when I was a young waiter. It's like 86. So maybe it's more of an American thing.
Well, so that's the thing. And like I've asked people I know. I asked I don't want to ask. I don't want to say who I've asked, but I've asked people I know who've never heard it either. But it's probably a bad comparison because we're in a very close. Or my family members never heard 86. So I take for granted like no idea what 86 is. By the comment section, maybe it's a sign of the people everyone who watches my channel. Everybody knew what 86 was, like hands down. Maybe there was 1 in 100 people who said never heard it before, and then maybe there were 5 in 100 who said, "Oh yeah, it's from the restaurant industry." But it seems that it was 95% of the people knew reflexively what it meant, going back to the 40s and 50s gangster movies. So I might be inclined to, but I still don't think she knew. I mean, that's the thing. I'm only imparting what my impression of her. Someone had to have known. I guarantee the people who started the campaign knew. That's why it was an edgy sort of double entendre. I still would think that she doesn't know, but my gosh, someone else, made an interesting observation. That the 8645 was under a pot of flowers, which could be representation in and of itself.
It was very, very interesting placement. So either she did it. We'll put it this way: whoever put that placement there knew what they were doing. Now, it may be the case that she wasn't the one who made that placement decision, but this was her big national news. For people who don't know, by the way, on national news, Whitmer goes out, and right behind her, underneath a little pot, is an 8645 little piece of whatever you call it. And 8645 was a movement that started this summer, and it has a quasi. You could say, oh, it means cancel. But everybody knows 86 knows it has a darker undercurrent of kill. And it's put this way. If Trump had put something out and if anyone had ever put out anything like 8644, that person would have been fired, canned, under investigation, all kinds of problems. If a Republican governor would have put 8644 behind him, CNN would be running constant loops of how black men had been lynched in the history of America. So it was interesting how the media treated it. Mostly the media ignored it and pretended it wasn't there, even though it was right there on their own broadcast, right behind her.
It was in your face, and It was egregious. The only thing you can, if I know people don't want to give Whitmer any benefit of the doubt, I would just assume everyone in her campaign knew sort of like a gag. Can we get away with it? But yeah,
Right.
it's given the amount of people who unequivocally, I'm just going through the chat here, who unequivocally know what it meant. It's not a mistake that can happen by accident. But
Right.
okay,
And
so
the anger is just so high in that world. It's why Madonna could think she could say, "I have dreams of blowing up the White House." I mean, when she spoke in 2017.
She can say she's Madonna's Madonna. This is the governor of Michigan. It's next level in terms of unacceptability. So that's interesting.
Now, it may be the case that Whitmer was trying to get more people to do this, because I'm very curious where the feds came up with this idea. It wouldn't surprise me if Whitmer's allies had allies at the FBI there in Michigan that created this whole thing. And she would like there to be maybe 2 or 3 more stories like this, because she wants to be the noble victim against the crazy Trumpist, while she just has to lock us all up in Michigan.
The timing of all of it was I mean, it's coincidental, and then sometimes there's no coincidences. But the entrapment argument, it's an interesting thing to follow. I mean, what do we expect? I mean, we would only find out about that defense.
They got some good lawyers. So they got some lawyers I know of in Wisconsin. So several of them got better extradition terms than Rittenhouse has yet to get. So skilled lawyers know how to handle those kind of things, and they got some good ones. So that's going to be a bigger fight. Normally, the reason why they never worry is because usually they pick nobodies. They pick people with no money who are just trying to be important in their own little space. Some of them will have mental issues, at least mental health issues of some type. They'll be off the res, at least some portion of the time. And the net effect of that is that normally they get railroaded easy. They have public defenders who don't really like them, don't really believe in them, let them get crushed. That didn't happen here, and they made a mistake.
So, do we know how the individuals are getting, let's say, quality representation?
They had some allies that surprised people.
Okay.
Also, Whitmer doesn't understand the degree of people who dislike her, that are very suspect of anything she does. So there's people with, I'll give you a little comparison. Trump is outraising Biden in almost every county in Michigan. So this assumption that Michigan really loves Whitmer, and there's a lot of signs that say otherwise. That we'll see on election night, but don't be surprised if Michigan turns red again.
Okay, that's interesting. It's an interesting. That was one of the. There's a market to bet on that if anybody's interested. So the next, what we're going to see, and I'm just bringing up some chats about other 86s that people now are putting together.
Yes.
What do we see? We're not going to see the defensive entrapment until this gets to trial. I mean, there's not going to be much of a social media.
There's some smart lawyers involved, so you'll start seeing it raised early. You'll see it. To some degree, it was discussed, I believe, in one of the extradition proceedings already, where the defendant got very favorable terms. You'll see it in getting more favorable bail terms. You'll see it in discovery. Don't be shocked if I'm right, if this case magically disappears 6 months from now, after the election.
Mm-hmm. Okay. It's very interesting. It's to be followed, and I guess we'll talk about it again later on.